The night had come fast in the Wyoming wilderness, a storm brewing in the distance as dark clouds rolled in across the sky. The wind howled through the trees, the air thick with the scent of rain. In the heart of the forest, a small clearing lay undisturbed, except for the occasional crack of lightning that illuminated the landscape for mere seconds, making the trees seem like giant shadows. The vast emptiness echoed with the sounds of nature, of wind rustling through leaves, branches swaying, and distant animal calls. A young girl, no more than 10, sat in the middle of the clearing, clutching the rough bark of an old oak tree. Her name was Sophie. She was alone, scared, and cold, but she was holding on. The storm had caught her off guard. It had come too fast, too violently. She'd been out hiking with her family, but the trail had split into unfamiliar territory. They'd been separated in the storm, and now Sophie had found herself lost. She had tied herself to the tree. It was the only way she knew to keep herself safe from the powerful gusts that threatened to tear her away, and the howling wind that seemed to scream at her, drowning out her thoughts. She was too small to withstand the storm, but Sophie's heart was filled with something else too, a quiet resolve. She had survived the day so far, and she would survive this too. Her phone had died, no signal for miles, and her small backpack carried only a few snacks and a water bottle. It was all she had. She fought the urge to panic, her chest tight as she tried to focus on her breathing. Her only hope now was to hold on and wait for help, even though she knew that help could be hours, maybe even days, away. But Sophie wasn't alone. A few hundred yards away, the storm's chaos was mirrored by something else. A pack of K9 dogs, highly trained, specialized search dogs, had been deployed to find missing persons in the area. They were experts, with their strong, muscled bodies and keen sense of smell. These dogs weren't ordinary. They were rescue dogs trained to handle any environment, any terrain, any weather condition. But tonight, they were facing something they'd never encountered before. The pack was led by a black shepherd dog named Ace, a seasoned veteran of rescue operations. His instincts were sharp, his loyalty unmatched. His team was with him: Bella, a white German shepherd with eyes that seemed to miss nothing; Thor, a powerful Belgian Malinois with a sharp bite and an even sharper nose; and Luna, a smaller, agile border collie mix who could fit into the tightest of spaces. As they moved through the storm, their handlers followed behind, but Ace and the pack led the way. They had been trained for this, to find the missing no matter the conditions. But tonight, their mission wasn't like any other. The storm was fierce, the visibility nearly impossible, and they had one goal: find the girl, Sophie. Ace's nose twitched in the wind. The scent of the storm was overwhelming, but beneath it, there was something else. Something he could smell faintly. His ears perked, his head tilted, and with one commanding bark, the pack was on alert. Sophie sat, still tied to the tree, her arms wrapped tightly around the rough bark. The wind whipped around her, making her shiver, but it was the sound of something else that brought her attention back to the present. She couldn't quite place it at first, but then it came again. A soft, distant bark. Her heart leapt in her chest. But was it real? Or was the storm playing tricks on her? The barks grew louder, closer. "Help!" Sophie called weakly, her voice barely audible against the wind. She tried again, but her throat felt raw. She couldn't help but cry out, "Help me, please." Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of paws moving through the brush, soft at first, but growing louder. Sophie held her breath. Could it be? She tugged at the rope around her wrist, trying to make herself more visible, more noticeable. The dogs had to see her. They had to. A flash of movement came from the shadows. The first dog, a sleek black shepherd, emerged from the trees and stopped in his tracks when he saw her. His eyes locked onto hers with an almost knowing expression, as if he could sense her fear. The others followed, moving swiftly and with purpose. Sophie gasped as the black shepherd approached her, his powerful frame cutting through the storm. She had seen K9 dogs before in rescue operations on TV, but seeing them in person, in the middle of this chaotic storm, was something different. "Please," Sophie whispered, "please help me." Ace didn't hesitate. He padded toward her, his eyes softening for just a moment. Then he turned his head slightly, a signal to the others. Bella, Thor, and Luna surrounded Sophie in a protective circle. They moved with purpose, communicating silently, each knowing exactly what needed to be done. The first dog, Ace, came closer, his nose gently nudging Sophie's hand. Sophie reached out, trembling, and touched his fur. It was warm. It was real. The storm howled louder, but in that moment, Sophie felt a strange sense of calm. These dogs had found her. They would get her out of here. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she reached out and touched Ace. The warmth of the dog's fur gave her a sense of hope, a spark of reassurance that perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't going to be alone in this storm after all. But the urgency was still there. She needed to get out. She had to survive. Ace's ears twitched at the sound of the wind. His body was still, but his gaze never left Sophie, as if he could sense her fear and confusion. He tilted his head slightly and then, as if understanding what was needed, he turned back to his team. Luna, Thor, Bella, the handler called out softly. His voice was barely audible over the storm, but the dogs had been trained for this. They responded with precision. Luna, the border collie, was the first to move, swiftly weaving through the brush as she approached Sophie. With a quick nudge of her nose, Luna began to tug at the ropes binding Sophie's hands. Sophie could hardly believe it. They're really helping me, she thought, barely able to comprehend the moment. Her hands were stiff from the cold, but Luna's gentle but firm motions helped loosen the knots. Thor and Bella stood nearby, keeping watch, their eyes scanning the surrounding area. They knew that the storm wasn't the only threat. There could be wild animals or predators lurking in the trees, drawn to the scent of the storm and the girls' distress. The K9 dogs were trained for more than just human rescue. They were guardians, protectors in every sense of the word. As Luna worked tirelessly to free Sophie, Ace circled the girl. He was calm, but his gaze never left her face, his body language exuding quiet strength. Sophie, trembling from the cold, could feel the weight of his watchful presence. She had always read about dogs in stories, but now, experiencing it firsthand, she could hardly believe how deeply these animals seemed to care. They weren't just following commands, they were driven by something deeper. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was training, but Sophie didn't care. All she knew was that she was being rescued, and these dogs, these remarkable animals, were doing it. Finally, Luna pulled free the last knot. Sophie's hands were free. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, choking on a sob. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from relief. "Thank you so much." Ace gave a small bark, as though acknowledging her gratitude. He moved closer, nudging her toward him gently, as if saying, "Come with me. We're not done yet." Sophie hesitated. The storm was still raging, and the winds were howling around them. She wasn't sure if she could keep up with the dogs, or if she had the strength to stand, but she had no choice. She could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, her body barely holding together from the ordeal of the storm. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, gripping the rough fur of Ace for support as she slowly pulled herself to her feet. As she stood, the rain began to pour even harder, the storm seeming to intensify with every minute. Sophie stumbled for a second, but Ace was there, guiding her with a steady presence. Bella and Thor moved forward, staying just ahead, their movements fluid and assured, as though they were already mapping out a path through the treacherous terrain. Luna ran back and forth, weaving in and out of the trees, scouting ahead, making sure nothing would take them by surprise. Sophie was amazed at how quickly they worked together. It was like a well-oiled machine, each dog knowing exactly where to go and what to do, never hesitating, never unsure. She could barely keep up with their pace, but Ace remained by her side, his strong, steady presence offering her reassurance with every step. Then came the first sign of real danger, a rustle in the trees to their left. A low growl echoed from the darkness, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against rock. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She could see the tension in Ace's body as he immediately positioned himself in front of her, growling softly, his hackles raised. Thor and Bella instantly moved into defensive positions, their sharp eyes scanning the area, looking for any signs of the threat. Luna darted to the side, ready to alert the pack to any danger. "What is it?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely a breath. Ace's eyes met hers, and in that instant, Sophie understood. The dogs were prepared for anything. The threat was real. Out of the shadows, 2 wild coyotes emerged, their eyes gleaming yellow in the storm's brief flashes of lightning. They were hungry, desperate, and drawn to the scent of Sophie's fear. They hadn't expected to find the girl in the company of such formidable guardians. But their instincts told them one thing: strike first. Thor and Bella stepped forward, teeth bared, their bodies tense. The coyotes circled, assessing the dogs with wary eyes. They knew they were no match for the K9s, but hunger and the instincts of predators clouded their judgment. Ace gave a commanding bark, and without hesitation, Thor lunged forward, snapping his jaws with terrifying speed. The coyotes yelped, backing away in fear, but Ace wasn't finished. He was relentless. With one powerful bound, he was on top of the first coyote, pushing it into the ground. The second coyote hesitated for a split second, and that was enough. Luna darted forward, biting the coyote's flank, sending it fleeing into the trees. The pack stood firm, their eyes glowing in the storm's brief flashes of light. The coyotes had retreated, and the danger had passed, but the tension in the air was still thick. Sophie let out a shaky breath, her heart still racing. "Are we safe?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Ace's eyes softened as he nudged her, offering her a moment of peace. They weren't done yet, but they had fought back the danger. And in that moment, Sophie knew that she was not alone. Not anymore. The pack had her back. As the storm raged on, the K9s led Sophie through the wilderness, never letting her fall behind. They knew the way. They knew where to go. And with them by her side, Sophie finally allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she might make it through this. The storm continued to lash out at them, a constant roar in the distance. As Sophie stumbled forward, the ground beneath her feet a slick mess of rain and mud. The K9s were still by her side. Ace, Luna, Thor, and Bella, each one a steadfast companion, guiding her through the wilderness, never wavering. Despite the chaos around them, Sophie could feel the calm that radiated from the dogs. They were her protectors now, and she had learned to trust them completely. The wind howled through the trees, sending branches swaying and cracking, but the pack moved with a quiet determination. Sophie could feel Ace's steady presence beside her, always just a few steps ahead, watching for any danger that might lurk in the shadows. The other dogs followed suit, each alert, each aware of their surroundings. They were trained for this, ready for any challenge that came their way. The pack was in sync, and Sophie knew they would stop at nothing to get her to safety. But the further they moved into the wilderness, the more Sophie realized just how deep in trouble she was. She had no idea how far they'd gone or how long the storm would last. Her body ached with fatigue, and every step felt heavier than the last. The cold, wet air seemed to seep into her bones, and her stomach growled with hunger. She could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on her chest, the endless gusts of wind pulling at her hair, biting through her clothes. But the dogs, Ace, Luna, Thor, and Bella, seemed unaffected, their bodies built for these harsh conditions. They were survivors, and they had become her lifeline. But Sophie wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. Her legs were sore, her strength waning, and her mind felt foggy. The storm felt endless. She kept her head down, focusing on her next step, trying not to get lost in the overwhelming feeling of being utterly alone. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. "We're getting closer," Sophie whispered to herself. But even she wasn't sure if she believed it. Ace's ears perked up, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He had always been the most vigilant of the pack, the first to pick up on danger, the first to notice any change in their surroundings. He stopped suddenly, then turned to look at Sophie, his dark eyes filled with understanding. Without a word, he motioned for the other dogs to stop. Luna, always on alert, barked once, a sharp, clear command. Bella and Thor, who had been scouting ahead, immediately returned to the group, ready for whatever was coming. The wind had died down for just a moment, a brief calm before the next wave of the storm. But in that silence, Sophie could hear it. A soft, distant noise, something out of place. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, her heart skipped a beat. A voice. "Help! Please!" Sophie's pulse quickened. Her legs nearly gave out from under her as the realization hit her. Someone else was out there, stranded, just like she had been. In the midst of the storm, in the middle of nowhere, another soul was in need of help. Ace barked again, and the other dogs moved into action. Sophie felt the surge of adrenaline fill her body. This wasn't just about her anymore. They were going to rescue someone else. Luna darted forward, her nose to the ground as she tracked the scent of the voice. The rest of the pack followed closely behind, moving with purpose, their bodies swift and sure. Sophie barely had time to process what was happening before Ace was at her side again, nudging her gently but insistently to follow. Through the trees they moved, navigating the rough terrain with ease. The forest seemed to close in on them, the darkness making it hard to see beyond a few feet. But the dogs didn't falter. Sophie trusted them, and the pack led the way without hesitation. As they neared the source of the voice, the sounds grew clearer. A woman, her voice strained, calling out weakly. Sophie felt her heart race in her chest. Who could it be? Was it another lost soul caught in the storm, or someone in need of help? Finally, they reached the clearing. The woman was on her knees, shivering, her clothes torn and dirty. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she looked as though she hadn't seen shelter in days. Her face was pale, and her lips were chapped from the cold. The storm had taken its toll on her, just like it had on Sophie, but the woman had been alone longer, and the exhaustion in her eyes was unmistakable. Without hesitation, Ace moved forward, approaching the woman with his characteristic calm. He stopped just a few feet away, lowering his head in a sign of respect, his eyes softening. Luna followed closely behind, then Thor and Bella, each one standing watch, keeping an eye on the surroundings. The woman gasped when she saw the dogs. Are you here to help me?" Her voice was cracked, but the hope in her eyes was undeniable. Sophie could see the relief flood through her. She wasn't alone anymore. Sophie, still trying to catch her breath, took a step forward, her voice trembling. "They're here to save us. They'll get us out of here." Ace turned his head toward Sophie, as if to confirm her words, then turned back to the woman, nudging her gently as if to say, "It's going to be okay." With a newfound sense of purpose, Sophie moved toward the woman. She wasn't sure how much energy she had left, but seeing someone else in need of rescue gave her strength. She extended her hand to the woman, offering her what little help she could. The woman grasped Sophie's hand weakly, and with Ace leading the way, they began their journey back. The storm may have been relentless, but now Sophie was no longer just a survivor. She was part of something bigger. With Ace, Luna, Thor, and Bella by her side, they were a team, a pack, and together they would make it through this. The storm had passed, but the trail of destruction was still evident all around them. The wind had died down, but the rain continued to drip from the trees, the soft sound of droplets hitting the forest floor mixing with the occasional bark from the dogs. Sophie's clothes were soaked, but her face had a determined look, a stark contrast to the frightened girl who had been tied to the tree just hours before. She looked up at Ace, who had stayed by her side through the entire ordeal. The other dogs, Luna, Thor, and Bella, had formed a protective circle around her as they trekked through the muddy terrain. The pack had led her through the wilderness, and now, they were close to what Sophie believed might be a cabin, her only hope. Ace turned back to glance at her, his amber eyes reflecting a sense of reassurance. The bond between them had grown deeper in these past few hours. What had begun as a lifeline, the dogs saving her life, was now a partnership, an unspoken understanding that Sophie wasn't just being saved. She was part of the pack now. Ahead, something caught Sophie's attention. A flash of movement, too slow to be an animal but too distinct to be anything else. She squinted, her heart racing. It was a person, stumbling, clearly struggling through the wet underbrush. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The woman was clearly injured, but her movements were still determined, her face grim. Sophie stepped forward, her mind telling her to wait, to call out. But something within her knew she couldn't just let this person suffer alone. She felt the weight of the dog's watchful eyes as Ace nudged her gently, signaling for caution. But Sophie had made up her mind. She approached. The woman looked up, eyes wide, and then softened when she saw Sophie's familiar face. "I thought I was going to die," the woman gasped, voice strained. "What are you doing out here, little one?" "I'm okay now," Sophie replied, taking a step closer. "You're not alone anymore. My dogs, they'll help you." The woman's eyes flicked to the dogs, who stood silently around Sophie. There was no fear, just curiosity. Ace, ever the leader, watched the stranger with cautious intensity, but Luna and Thor circled behind Sophie, forming an almost protective barrier around them both. "I didn't think anyone would be out here," the woman whispered, her gaze dropping to the ground as she seemed to gather her strength. "You're not alone," Sophie repeated, her voice filled with newfound conviction. "I'm here, and I'll help you." The woman's eyes softened, the exhaustion in her face evident, but something else, hope, began to creep into her tired expression. Sophie reached out to steady her, but before she could, Ace moved forward, nudging the woman's hand with his nose. The woman gasped. "What?" "It's okay," Sophie reassured her. "Ace knows where to go. Follow him." The dogs, without hesitation, began to move in unison, their instincts guiding them. Ace led the way, the others following. Sophie and the woman stayed close, with the dogs providing a sense of safety that neither of them had felt in hours. The trees parted as they approached the cabin, a small, isolated structure. Sophie didn't realize it at first, but the woman's hand had found hers, squeezing it lightly in gratitude. Sophie didn't mind. She understood now. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was part of the story, an integral piece in this strange, wild world. A girl who, with the help of 4 extraordinary dogs, had found her way through the impossible. They reached the cabin, and as the door creaked open, Sophie stepped inside. The warmth from a small fire immediately surrounded her, and the familiar scent of a fire burning filled her senses. Before she could sit down, Ace stood before her. He nuzzled her gently, his eyes full of something Sophie couldn't quite place. Pride? Love? Gratitude? She wasn't sure, but she reached out to stroke his fur. "You did it," Sophie whispered to him, her voice filled with emotion. Ace gave a low, rumbling growl of contentment, then turned to face the others. Luna, Thor, and Bella had settled around the cabin's hearth, their eyes slowly closing as the warmth of the fire embraced them. The storm had passed, but their journey was not over. Sophie, still in awe of what she'd just experienced, felt something settle within her. She was safe, she was home, and she was no longer alone. As she lay down on a nearby cot, the fire crackling softly beside her, Sophie closed her eyes. The K9s were by her side, their presence an unwavering reminder that she had found not just survival, but family. They had been her saviors, and now they were her protectors. The days that followed were a blur of healing and quiet reflection. The storm had passed, and with it, a new chapter had begun for Sophie. She was no longer just the scared little girl in the woods. She had found not only her strength but also an unlikely family in the pack of K9 dogs that had saved her. But despite the safety of the cabin, there was still something Sophie couldn't shake. A lingering feeling that her journey wasn't truly over. The world outside still needed her, and she couldn't just hide away forever. She needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and most importantly, she had to make sure the woman they had found in the woods, Maya, was all right. Sophie stood at the window of the cabin, looking out into the vast, empty forest beyond. The trees stretched far into the distance, and the mountains seemed like silent guardians of this remote corner of the world. Maya had managed to regain her strength with the dog's help, and Sophie had spent hours talking with her, learning how the woman had found herself lost in the wilderness, separated from her own group during the storm. But now, Maya was quiet, her emotions still raw. She hadn't spoken much about her past, and Sophie sensed that something was weighing on her. Ace, who had been lying nearby, lifted his head at the sound of Sophie's footsteps. He had become Sophie's constant companion, always at her side, always protective. Sophie smiled at him, crouching to give him a pat. "You're not going to let me out of your sight, are you?" Sophie whispered, her voice filled with fondness. Ace barked softly and nudged her hand, his eyes steady and calm. Maya entered the room quietly, her eyes tired but grateful. She walked over to where Sophie was standing by the window and paused. "You're right, you know," Maya said softly. "I can't stay here forever. We're going to have to find a way out." Sophie turned, her brow furrowing. "You don't think the dogs can help?" Maya sighed. "They've done so much for me already, but I think we might be pushing it. There's a town about a day's walk from here. I can't ask you to risk all of this, Sophie. You've already done more than anyone could expect." Sophie's heart clenched at the thought of leaving the safety of the cabin, the comfort of the K9S, and the security of the wilderness that had given her back her life. She glanced at Ace, Luna, Thor, and Bella, who had gathered nearby, their eyes alert. "You don't have to ask," Sophie said firmly, her voice determined. "The dogs are with me, and we're not leaving you behind." Maya looked at her, surprise flashing across her face. "But you're just a child." "You." "I'm not a child anymore," Sophie interrupted. "I know these woods. I know these dogs. And together we'll get you out of here." Maya swallowed hard, her emotions rising to the surface. Sophie could see the woman fighting against the vulnerability that had crept into her heart. For the first time since they'd met, Maya smiled. It was a small smile, but it was the first real one Sophie had seen since their paths had crossed in the wilderness. "Then we leave tomorrow," Maya said, her voice a little stronger. The next morning, the air was crisp and cold as the group began to prepare for their journey. Sophie made sure to pack the essentials: water, some food, and a first aid kit, while Maya gathered her belongings. The dogs seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, their posture stiffening as they lined up, ready to go. Ace led the way, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, following the familiar scents of the forest. The other dogs, Luna, Thor, and Bella, kept close, staying within the protective circle they had formed around Sophie and Maya. They were no longer just animals guiding a little girl through the woods. They had become her allies, her guardians. The trek through the forest was more difficult than Sophie had anticipated. The terrain was treacherous, the ground slick with mud from the storm. But Ace never faltered. He moved with an almost supernatural sense of direction, pausing only to check in with Sophie and Maya, ensuring they were safe. By midday, the forest opened up, revealing a wide stretch of hills that seemed to roll on endlessly. The trees had thinned, and the air felt warmer, a welcome change from the chill of the mountain forests. But as they crossed a ridge, Sophie's heart stopped. A low growl broke the silence. Ace stopped in his tracks, his head raised, ears alert. The other dogs instantly became tense, their bodies coiled, ready to react. Maya stepped forward, her face pale. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie didn't answer. She knew. They weren't alone anymore. A figure appeared at the edge of the trees. A massive wolf. Its fur was dark and sleek, its eyes glowing with an eerie intensity as it locked onto Sophie and the dogs. The wolf didn't move at first, watching them with a calculating gaze. Sophie's breath hitched. It was big, bigger than anything she had seen before. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur, and its teeth gleamed in the dim light. But then, something unexpected happened. Ace stepped forward, lowering his head. He growled low in his throat, a challenge to the wild creature standing before them. Sophie's heart raced, but she couldn't look away. Maya stepped back, her hand instinctively going to Sophie's arm. What's happening? Why isn't it attacking? Sophie stayed silent, her eyes never leaving Ace, who was now standing between them and the wolf. The wolf let out a deep, guttural growl, but Ace didn't back down. Instead, the K9 led the way, stepping forward, his body poised and ready. Luna, Thor, and Bella flanked Sophie and Maya protectively, but they stayed silent, trusting their leader's instincts. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the wolf did something that shocked Sophie. It lowered its head, acknowledging Ace's dominance. The two animals locked eyes, and for a split second, Sophie swore she saw a flicker of understanding between them. With one final growl, the wolf turned and disappeared back into the forest, melting into the shadows from which it came. Ace relaxed, his posture shifting back to the calm, watchful stance he always held. Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. That was incredible. Sophie nodded, still shaken by the encounter. Ace knows what he's doing. He won't let anything happen to us. The journey was far from over. With the wolf encounter behind them, the air seemed thicker, the silence more profound. Sophie and Maya walked side by side, but the safety they once felt was now tinged with unease. Ace, as always, led the way, his keen senses alert to the dangers that lurked around every corner. Luna, Thor, and Bella remained close to Sophie, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, their loyalty unwavering. The trail they followed grew steeper, winding up the side of a mountain, and the forest began to give way to rocky outcroppings. As they climbed higher, the air thinned, and Sophie could feel the strain in her legs. Maya, too, was slowing down, her strength still fragile, though the dog's presence seemed to give her an inner resilience that had been absent when they first met. The weight of their mission pressed down on Sophie. She knew that if they didn't find help soon, the situation could become dire. Maya was still recovering, and the wilderness wasn't a forgiving place. The thought of the town they were heading toward, still miles away, kept her going. But as they neared the top of the ridge, something in the air changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the breeze, a faint scent carried on the wind. But Ace's reaction was immediate. He stopped dead in his tracks, his ears perked, nostrils flaring. The other dogs stiffened, their bodies taut with tension. "What is it, Ace?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. She stepped closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest. Ace barked sharply, the sound ringing through the air. The others followed suit, their collective growls growing louder, more urgent. Maya's face went pale, her eyes darting around nervously. Sophie reached out, placing a hand on Ace's side, trying to comfort him. But the K9 dog was unyielding, his focus entirely on the path ahead. It wasn't the wind he was reacting to. It was something else, something dangerous. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed through the forest. A shadow shifted in the trees, moving quickly and quietly. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had heard that sound before. "Wolves," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. Maya's eyes widened in fear. "Are they coming for us?" Ace's ears twitched at the sound of movement ahead. The pack of K9s grew even more alert, their bodies poised to spring into action. Sophie knew that in this moment, she wasn't just relying on the dog's strength. She was relying on their bond. She had seen them fight to protect her, seen them give everything to ensure her safety. And she knew, deep in her bones, that they wouldn't stop. In the distance, a flash of movement caught her eye. A group of wolves, their fur dark against the underbrush, were emerging from the trees. They were circling the ridge, their eyes glinting with hunger. Sophie could see the glint of their fangs, the way their muscles rippled beneath their fur. But Ace didn't hesitate. With a growl, he stepped forward, his hackles raised, and the other dogs followed suit, ready for a fight. Luna and Thor took positions flanking Sophie, their eyes focused, while Bella remained near Maya, her protective stance unwavering. Sophie felt a rush of adrenaline. The wolves were closing in, their growls growing louder, But Ace stood tall, unwavering. He wasn't just protecting her. He was leading the charge. Sophie could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, and she knew this could be the moment they either won or lost. The wolves were closing in fast, and she could hear their feet crunching on the leaves as they drew nearer. "Stay close," Sophie whispered to Maya, though her voice barely registered above the sound of the wolves. Maya nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know what to do." Sophie didn't take her eyes off the advancing wolves. "Stay close to the dogs. They'll protect us." It was a moment of truth. Ace's growl intensified, his eyes locked on the leader of the pack of wolves, a large alpha with piercing amber eyes. The alpha wolf snarled, showing its teeth, challenging Ace's dominance. It was a battle for control of the wilderness, and both the K9S and the wolves knew that only one could claim it. For a tense moment, neither side moved, and then Ace sprang into action. His powerful legs propelled him forward, charging toward the alpha wolf with a speed that left the others in awe. The rest of the dogs followed in a coordinated attack, flanking the wolves from every side. Sophie's heart raced as she watched the dogs move with a precision she hadn't thought possible. The wolves, though strong and agile, couldn't match the K9's sheer force and coordination. Ace went straight for the alpha, while the other dogs held back the rest of the pack. The battle was fierce, but the dogs fought with a resolve that came from their bond with Sophie. Sophie clenched her fists, her knuckles white as she watched the fight unfold. The air was filled with snarls and the sound of claws against the earth. Ace locked jaws with the alpha, the two of them wrestling fiercely, but the K9 dog's determination was unmatched. With one final, powerful move, Ace forced the alpha to retreat. The pack of wolves, seeing their leader falter, hesitated. That was all the K9s needed. The wolves retreated into the trees, their growls fading as they disappeared into the forest. The battle was over, and the K9s had won. Sophie let out the breath she had been holding. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at Ace, who stood tall, panting but unscathed. The other dogs circled around him, their tails wagging in triumph. Sophie ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You did it, Ace," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "You protected us." Ace licked her face, his eyes calm and steady. Maya, still shaken, approached them slowly. She looked at the dogs with a newfound respect, her fear now replaced with admiration. "Thank you," Maya said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think we'd have made it without you." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We've got this. Together, we can do anything." As the K9 dogs stood watch around the campfire, their forms silhouetted against the fading sunset, Sophie couldn't help but think back to the day when her life had changed forever. The storm, the fear, the moment she had been tied to that tree, helpless and alone. But now, with the dogs by her side, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She'd made it through the worst, and they had been her saviors, her protectors, her family. Maya, still recovering from her injuries, rested her head on Sophie's lap. The young girl stroked her fur gently, as if every touch could somehow communicate the gratitude she felt in her heart. The bond between them was unspoken but deep, an understanding that needed no words. As the evening chill crept in, Sophie looked around at the dogs, each one alert, yet calm. Her eyes lingered on their leader, Max, the strong K9 who had led the pack that day. His intense gaze softened as he met her eyes. Sophie smiled. "You're my heroes," she whispered, her voice full of quiet emotion. Max seemed to nod, as if acknowledging the sentiment, before returning his gaze to the darkening woods. Maya stirred and lifted her head, her eyes meeting Sophie's. The girl gently wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. She had been through so much, but now, with the dogs and Maya beside her, she felt a sense of safety she hadn't known in a long time. Days passed, and life slowly returned to normal for Sophie, Maya, and the K9 dogs. The trauma they had endured began to fade, replaced by the unshakable bond they had forged. The connection between Sophie and the K9s grew stronger, more profound. Every day, she spent time with them, learning their ways, understanding their language through subtle gestures and expressions. Maya, though still recovering physically, was thriving emotionally. She had been given a second chance, and with Sophie's help, she learned to trust again. The dogs were always there, steady and loyal, guiding them both through each new day. One afternoon, as Sophie sat in the field, watching the dogs play, she felt a wave of emotion rush over her. It wasn't just the gratitude for the K9s protection. It was the realization that she had become part of something much bigger than herself. Her bond with Maya and the dogs had transformed her. She was no longer just the scared little girl tied to a tree in the wilderness. She was strong. She was a survivor. And most importantly, she had found her place in the world. Several months later, Sophie stood at the edge of a training field, watching as Maya and the other K9s worked with their handlers. She had grown used to the presence of the dogs in her life, but today felt different. She had an overwhelming sense of pride in what they had accomplished together. The bond between humans and animals was undeniable, and Sophie now understood it more deeply than anyone else could. Maya, now fully recovered, stood by Sophie's side, looking up at her with an almost knowing gaze. Sophie smiled and gave her a gentle pat. "You're not just my protector," Sophie whispered. "You're my family." Behind them, the K9 unit's team leader, Officer Daniels, called out to Sophie. "Ready for your training session?" he asked with a grin. Sophie nodded. She had been training to become a K9 handler herself, inspired by the incredible teamwork and courage of the dogs who had saved her. Today, she was going to work with Max and the other dogs, strengthening the bond she shared with them and learning how to lead. As the training session began, Sophie couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought her here. The storm, the rescue, and the unbreakable bond between her and the K9s. She had been through the unimaginable, but she had emerged stronger, more confident, and more connected to the world around her than she ever thought possible. And as she looked out across the field, surrounded by the K9s and Maya, Sophie knew that her future was filled with limitless possibilities. Together, they had faced the darkest moments and had come out victorious. And now, as a young K9 handler, Sophie was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun set on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the training field. Sophie stood beside Maya. The K9 dogs gathered around her like a protective shield. She felt at peace, knowing that the bond they shared would last a lifetime. From that moment forward, Sophie knew she had found her calling. She would work alongside the K9 unit, helping to protect others and ensuring that the bond between humans and animals would never be broken. The journey she had started that day, when she had been found tied to that tree, was just the beginning of something much greater. And as the K9s playfully ran across the field, Sophie couldn't help but smile. With Maya and the dogs by her side, she knew she was ready for anything.